What is an adaptation, and why are they everywhere? What makes a good adaptation? And how do I start thinking about adaptations as an option for my own creative practice? Today, I want to go on a little exploratory journey about adaptations. Yes, this was specifically brought on by both Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein and the rage baiting around Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights, but it's something I think about a lot as an artist who works with classical texts often. And yes, this video is mostly about classic pieces being adapted, most often old books or plays, though it could be something like a poem, a myth, or a true historic event. A lot of this commentary will probably ring true for all adaptations, but I just haven't really taken the time to see how my logic and thoughts play out for contemporary stuff. I also think adaptations of classics have both more leniency and more of a barrier, if that makes sense, because the source material was written for a very different audience and a very different understanding of the world, so there's a lot more that has to be done to adapt them successfully, in my opinion, but on the flip side of the coin, it also has a broader scope for interpretation. You have a bit more of a creative license. You also don't have to worry about Emily Bronte suing you for defamation or Shakespeare making a copyright claim. Older works also have their own history in our shared collective consciousness, which can either be a boon or a burden depending on how you slice it. I also want to quickly say that this video is in no way going to tackle the whole scope and breadth of adaptation studies. As with most of my videos, the deeper I dig, the more there is to know. For example, I won't be talking about the moral implications of what is or is not in the classical canon, and I won't be talking about whether or not adaptations of certain pieces should be made. There's also a really interesting and newer aspect of adaptation studies that talks about fan culture and the internet and how it has shifted adaptation criteria. While I won't be talking about Wattpad fanfiction today, just know there is a place for it in a larger discussion on adaptation. Adaptation is defined in a myriad of ways in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Adaptation, noun. 1. Something that is adapted. Very helpful. Specifically, a composition rewritten into a new form, such as a screen adaptation of a novel. 2. The act or process of adapting. Adaptation to changing circumstances. 3. Adjustment to environmental conditions, such as A. Adjustment of a sense organ to the intensity or quality of stimulation. And remember this aspect of the definition because we're going to return to it later. B. Modification of an organism or its part that makes it more fit for existence under the conditions of its environment. A heritable physical or behavioral trait that serves a specific function and improves an organism's fitness or survival. Adaptation is, of course, a scientific term as well as a literary or creative one. Adaptations such as bipedalism and an omnivorous diet, say that 5 times fast, has aided humans significantly in survival. So I like to think of adaptation as a tool for survival, whether that is the survival of a species or of a story. How human stories have survived across cultures and time is constant adaptation. As Canadian scholar and author of the book A Theory of Adaptation, Linda Hutchins says when asked about her interest in adaptation, she says, "This is how we, I think, have always told stories. We haven't just told stories from the beginning of human time, we've retold stories, and that's what interests me. Only one of Shakespeare's plays isn't an adaptation, and even it adapts conventions from other things. So this is a history of how we've always been." The one Shakespeare play that isn't an adaptation is Love's Labour's Lost, by the way. Also sort of The Tempest. But again, even those two borrow from previous traditions and have bits and pieces of other archetypes and stories in it. Adaptation also has many modes and forms. In her book Adaptation and Appropriation, scholar Julie Sanders says, "Adaptation studies throws up a rich lexicon of terms. Version, variation, interpretation, continuation, transformation, imitation, pastiche, parody, forgery, travesty, transposition, reevaluation, revision, rewriting, echo." But, as this list suggests, texts that come under this heading can possess starkly different, even opposing, aims and intentions. As a result, adaptation studies necessarily favors a kind of open structuralism. I would also posit that translation is inherently an act of adaptation. While not changing forms, there is a transformation happening from one language to another, and with it comes the creative and logistical choices of a culture change as well. Some things lost, some things gained. For example, a Chekhov play performed in America must always be an adaptation. Not only are the words themselves translated from the original Russian, but the creative team is taking a play written for a Russian audience in the late 1800s and approximating the humor, political sentiment, and characterization of the Russian stage at the time for a contemporary American audience. Original nuances are lost to time and circumstance, and other nuances are picked up and gained from what is happening in the current American culture. Sometimes, in order for a play or a piece to have the same meaning it would have had when it was written, it has to be transformed. Shakespeare being performed accurately to how it was in Elizabethan England today is nothing like it would have been received then. Shakespeare was not highbrow. It was full of cultural commentary, dirty jokes, and references to pop culture, something that gets lost in traditional productions, but can find new life in adaptations such as Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, or something like 10 Things I Hate About You. If you want an excellent deep dive into adaptation studies, I highly recommend checking out Julie Sanders' book. For a scholarly text, it is incredibly easy to read and provides a myriad of examples from film, contemporary literature, and theater. Sanders makes clear that there are many types of adaptations. Adaptation isn't just about being accurate to a source text, it is commenting on the source text and adding to the conversation that the source text began. Adaptation is a way for artists to contribute to the various myths we have at any given time and to continue their cycle. Paradise Lost is Milton's adaptation of the Book of Genesis in the Bible. George Bernard Shaw's St. Joan is an adaptation of Joan of Arc's life and trials. Shakespeare's Hamlet is an adaptation of both a popular English play of the 1580s and a Scandinavian myth. Religions adapt stories from other, older religions to create new religions, like how the Greek and Roman pantheon are almost the same, but with different names. Humans adapt biologically, and it only makes sense that the way we tell our stories adapts too. Wait, is everything adaptation? Anyways, we went from visual storytelling, think cave paintings, though I'm sure there were other methods unknown to us, oral traditions that included chanting and singing and epic poetry, theater as invented by the Greeks. Then with the invention of the printing press in the 1400s, storytelling shifted to the written word and was dispersed widely through paper. And in the modern era, other technologies such as radio, cinema, and the internet, now stories can be told through dozens of mediums. Julie Sanders is clear that adaptation studies is not interested in making judgments on whether an adaptation is good or not. It is mainly engaged with process, ideology, and methodology rather than encouraging polarized value judgments. I, however, will be encouraging individual value judgments in this video because I am focusing not only on the solely academic study of adaptation, but the real-life artistic practice behind it. And artistry requires opinion and subjective evaluation. Okay, so adaptation is one of the most natural and long-standing storytelling traditions. So let's narrow it down. What makes a good adaptation, especially of a classic story? Well, first, let's tackle what I mean by classic. Richard J. Smith identifies a classic as this. First, the work must focus on matters of great importance, identifying fundamental human problems and providing some sort of guidance for dealing with them. Second, it must address these fundamental issues in beautiful, moving, and memorable ways with stimulating and inviting images. Third, it must be complex, nuanced, comprehensive, and profound, requiring careful and repeated study in order to yield its deepest secrets and greatest wisdom. One might add that precisely because of these characteristics, a classic has great staying power across both time and space. Italo Calvino, the Italian novelist and author of Why Read the Classics, was not as brief, giving us 14 criteria for what makes a classic. 1. The classics are those books about which you usually hear people saying, "I'm rereading," never "I'm reading." 2. The classics are those books which constitute a treasured experience for those who have read and loved them, but they remain just as rich an experience for those who reserve the chance to read them for when they are in the best condition to enjoy them. 3. The classics are books which exercise a particular influence, both when they imprint themselves on our imagination as unforgettable, and when they hide in the layers of memory disguised as the individual's or the collective unconscious. 4. A classic is a book which with each rereading offers as much of a sense of discovery as the first reading. 5. A classic is a book which even when we read it for the first time gives the sense of rereading something we have read before. 6. A classic is a book which has never exhausted all it has to say to its readers. 7. The classics are those books which come to us bearing the aura of previous interpretations and trailing behind them the traces they have left in the culture or cultures, or just in the languages and customs through which they have passed. 8. A classic is a work which constantly generates a pulviscular cloud of critical discourse around it, but which always shakes the particles off. 9. Classics are books which, the more we think we know them through hearsay, the more original, unexpected, and innovative we find them when we actually read them. 10. A classic is the term given to any book which comes to represent the whole universe, a book on par with ancient talismans. 11. And this one is really important in personal creative practice. Your classic is a book to which you cannot remain indifferent, and which helps you define yourself in relation or even in opposition to it. 12. A classic is a work that comes before other classics, but those who have read other classics first immediately recognize its place in the genealogy of classic works. 13. A classic is a work which relegates the noise of the present to a background hum, which at the same time the classics cannot exist without. And 14, a classic is a work which persists as a background noise even when a present that is totally incompatible with it holds sway. I think that pretty much covers it. And what's that old adage about porn? You can't define it, but you know it when you see it. That's kind of how I feel about classics. A good question is, can something new be a classic? And to that question, I'm not quite sure. I do think there needs to be a certain passage of time before it can be solidified as a part of the, traditional classic canon, but the term modern classic is applied to books like The Hunger Games, The Book Thief, The God of Small Things, A Gentleman in Moscow, The Kite Runner, Life of Pi, etc. I think only time will tell if they have the same staying power as something like Jane Eyre, Dubliners, or The Odyssey. For artistic purposes, it's best to stick to adaptations of things in the public domain, unless you want to figure out copyright law, and I certainly don't. What do 10 Things I Hate About You, She's the Man, The King, Anyone But You, Warm Bodies, West Side Story, and Scotland, PA have in common? They're all Shakespeare adaptations. Shakespeare adaptations are certainly the most popular form of adaptation. Whether it's a one-for-one translation of his work to the stage or screen, such as Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, or Joel Cohen's The Tragedy of Macbeth, taking inspiration from his work like The King, Ophelia, She's the Man, and 10 Things I Hate About You, incorporating his text and characters into a larger story like Mona Awad's All's Well, and Mel Rio's If We Were Villains, Ghostlight, Enter Ghost, or even Hamnet, there are so many examples of how the bard has influenced generations of storytellers. Shakespeare is a scaffolding on which to hang a story. When someone chooses to adapt Shakespeare, whether in a more obvious way or more subtly, they are invoking a resonant and rich cultural and artistic history. The names Romeo and Juliet immediately bring a bounty of lush and dramatic images and phrases to mind. You aren't building from scratch. There's a whole cultural lexicon to draw from, which is why so many artists have chosen his work to adapt. Also, a quick detour here. I am currently in pre-production for a short film that incorporates elements of Shakespeare's characterizations of Joan of Arc from his play Henry VI Part 1. There will be links to our trailer, a fundraising video, and the link to our Seed and Spark, all in the description if you would like to help us make this film a reality. I just thought I should let you know that I practice what I preach. Okay. Back to it. Like I mentioned earlier, Shakespeare himself was a great adapter. Julie Sanders says, Geoffrey Bulla's influential 8-volume series, Narrative and Dramatic Sources of Shakespeare, was, and still is, a standard presence in any university reference library. The organization of Bulla's volumes proves insightful. He divides his chapters in accordance with the following categories: direct source, analog, translation, possible source, and probable source. The direct sources include Cinthio's prose text about a jealous Moor reworked as Othello, the story of Pyramus and Thisbe from Ovid's Metamorphosis, which is performed by the Mechanicals in A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Thomas Lodge's Rosalind, incorporated into As You Like It. Perhaps a useful way of thinking about adaptation is as a form of collaborative writing across time, and sometimes across culture or language. Shakespeare's age had a far more open approach to literary borrowing and imitation than the modern era of copyright and property law encourages or even allows. Imitation was learned and practiced in schools and continued into adult writing careers. Shakespeare would perhaps have expected to be adapted by future ages and writers for this very reason. Jean Marsden has suggested that Ben Jonson's famous poetic observation that Shakespeare was not of an age but for all time need not be taken to endorse the hoary old claims to his universality, but rather as an indication that he remains available to subsequent ages to adapt and adopt as they wish. Shakespeare's cultural value, then, lies in part in his availability. As Marsden notes, each new generation attempts to redefine Shakespeare's genius in contemporary terms, projecting its desires and anxieties onto his work. Returning to the idea I spoke about earlier with traditional versus liberal Shakespeare productions, is every kind of Shakespeare production an active adaptation? I would argue yes. There are elements that must be enacted that we don't see on the page and have no reference for historically. Even the most historically accurate production is guessing a good deal of the time about things like pronunciation, staging, and acting styles. Shakespeare isn't alive to guide us to be faithful, and even if he was, the relevance of his plays today is completely different to the way they were relevant when he wrote them, at least in specifics. The overarching themes remain relevant because humans and our big problems and emotions are the same, but the minutiae of culture and politics are vastly different. So we get to take the big juicy stuff in his plays and use them, while changing the littler stuff to make sure it isn't lost on the audience just how many dick jokes he wrote in there, or just how politically relevant something like Richard II or Julius Caesar can be. I want to cite the oft-cited 2017 Shakespeare in the Park production of Julius Caesar that used the Trump presidency as its concept and setting as an example for how adaptation can throw a new lens onto a piece. It was so controversial that Delta Airlines and Bank of America withdrew their sponsorship of the production. Shakespeare, in 2017, was causing political upset. Imagine a theater production causing that much disruption that huge companies draw their support from a production. And Shakespeare in the Park is a major organization here in New York City. So it was a big deal. And I think it's really cool and speaks to how theater is still relevant and can still make a difference when people get that riled up over it. Listen to the below lines from Caesar with an American political lens. And this production was back in 2017, but perhaps it only grows richer with the time that has passed. In Act 1, Scene 2, Brutus and Cassius have an exchange while Caesar is being celebrated by a crowd for his return to Rome. Brutus says, "What means this shouting? I do fear the people choose Caesar for their king." And Cassius says, "Aye, do you fear it? Then must I think you would not have it so." And then later on in the scene, Cassius says, "Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men at some time are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings." I don't think the Trump admin and Julius Caesar make for a perfect one-to-one adaptation, but damn is it evocative. It takes a stance, it says something. Even if the point isn't a perfect thesis, it makes you hear the text differently. It makes some people hear the text at all. Sometimes it takes a detail of a costume, or time period, or an administration to get an audience to see how text from 400 years ago illuminates how humans have always been dealing with the same joys and sorrows, trials and tribulations, heroes and villains. This is where things get subjective. No one is going to universally agree on what makes a good adaptation and which specific adaptations are good examples, because preference. But I have thought a lot about the adaptations I have interacted with, and there are a few similarities between the effective ones and the ones I think kind of miss the mark. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and let me know in the comments if you think there are other non-negotiables to be added. 1. There is a clear point of view. There is a reason for the adaptation. And as a sub-criteria, the lead artist or ensemble are aligned and in agreement about the story they are telling and how it bounces off or diverges from the original intentionally. The reason for the adaptation, that seed the original planted that spurred the adaptation to be conceived, is present throughout the piece. 2. Full use of the chosen medium. A movie does things only a movie can. A play does things only a play can, and so forth. If you're going to adapt a novel into a movie, your adaptation should be full of things that only cinema can do. Otherwise, leave it as a novel. 3. respect for the source material. This is one I can be convinced otherwise on, but I do find that even in pieces that aim to talk back to the source material have a certain reverence, even if it kind of goes hand in hand with discomfort or distaste, with the material they are riffing on. I'm thinking about pieces like Taming of the Shrew, Othello, Measure for Measure. Most artists who choose to adapt these pieces are trying to solve their icky or problematic aspects because they have some deep love for some other aspect of the piece, a character, the language, the B-plot. I can't think off the top of my head of an adaptation I liked that was working in complete contempt of the source material. If you can think of one, please let me know. So I hesitatingly name this component as my third criteria. Some of these examples would be closer to what Julie Sanders calls appropriations. An adaptation most often signals a relationship with an informing source text, either through its title or through more embedded references. An Anglophone cinematic version of Shakespeare's Hamlet, although clearly reinterpreted by the collaborative efforts of director, scriptwriter, actors, and the generic demands of the movement from stage drama to film, remains, ostensibly, Hamlet. Appropriation frequently affects a more decisive journey away from the informing text into a wholly new cultural product and domain, often through the actions of interpolation and critique as much as through the movement from one genre to others. Indeed, appropriation may or may not involve a generic shift and may certainly still require the kinds of readings alongside or comparative approaches that juxtapose at least one text against another, which we have begun to delineate as central to the reception of adaptations. But certainly appropriations tend to have a more complicated, intricate, and sometimes embedded relationship to their intertexts than a straightforward film version of a canonical or well-known text would suggest. The relationship can therefore seem more sideways or deflected, further along the spectrum of distance than a straightforward generic transposition. I will not personally be separating the two, though I think the idea of further categorizing types of adaptations can be helpful when figuring out what appeals to you, and it's certainly interesting to think about. Just a quick example, a stage adaptation of Taming of the Shrew is going to be an adaptation, whereas 10 Things I Hate About You is an appropriation. Just kind of an example. Emma, directed by Autumn de Wilde. I love this adaptation. I think it does a really good job of both historical and book accuracy. It also translates the quirky humor of Austen that can be easy to lose in more sweeping dramatic interpretations of her work, such as the 2005 Pride and Prejudice film. And no shade to that film, I love it also, but for different reasons. I highly, highly recommend checking this film out if you haven't yet and you love Jane Austen. Romeo plus Juliet, directed by Baz Luhrmann. This one is a bit polarizing, I think, but it does an excellent job of taking a theatrical text and making it specifically cinematic while keeping the theatrical elements that make it shine. My biggest note for this movie is the way they absolutely destroyed the character of Juliet. You can tell it was cut to be a Romeo-centric film. To not even keep most of Juliet's most famous speeches is a crime to me, but I digress. It's still an effective adaptation because it has a really, really strong point of view, aesthetic choices, and it makes the most of the medium. 10 Things I Hate About You, Clueless, She's the Man. These are all definitely loose adaptations / appropriations. There's hardly a lick of Shakespeare or Austen in these bad boys, but the character names and traits and storylines stick to the originals pretty damn well. These adaptations are incredibly effective because they made the stories a part of pop culture in a way that they just weren't before. The brilliance of the character archetypes and the plots shine from the original material, but it's updated and translated for a teenage audience's attention. Muppets: A Christmas Carol. I don't think I need to say too much more on this one. Easy A. This movie is so brilliant. Not only is it a great modern interpolation on the Scarlet Letter, it also holds a lot of analysis and commentary on the story itself and of other adaptations of it. I love this film, and in my opinion, it remains one of Emma Stone's best performances. Throwing a bit of a curveball in here with Unreal Unearthed by Hosier, it's an adaptation of Dante's Inferno. I love obsessive little weirdos on the internet because someone has posted an in-depth analysis of Unreal Unearthed and the references to Inferno. The link to the post is in the description. They've done my work for me, so check it out. Some adaptations will become classics themselves. What comes to mind is The Wide Sargasso Sea, which is sort of an adaptation / appropriation of Jane Eyre, where it reimagines Bertha Mason, the mad woman in the attic's story. That novel can be read in isolation, but it is made so much richer if you know Jane Eyre. And once you read The Wide Sargasso Sea, it's really hard to read Jane Eyre the same way. The ones I mentioned are just a few popular ones that I find to be effective for various reasons, but the list is by no means exhaustive or thorough. Let me know your favorite adaptation in the comments and why you love it. And a reminder that an adaptation is a bridge. Not every bridge is to every person's capacity or needs, and not every bridge is structurally sound either. Some are just pretty to look at, some will fall if too much weight is put on them, or some can withstand decades and crowds. Your mileage may vary. Okay, so you have a story or source text in mind to adapt. Maybe it's simply a famous classical character you want to work with or delve into. What are some things you should start thinking about? 1. Understand your why. I think the first thing to consider after choosing a piece to adapt is your reason for adapting it. Some questions to consider. What is the seed that this piece planted in my gut that is driving me towards adaptation? What are the indispensable elements that I feel glued to in the original? Is it a character, a scene, the dialogue, or the text itself? The tone, the plot as written? A few elements of each? Write down what elements you would be ashamed to slash from your version, and we'll come back to these. What is your point of view? Why are you adapting this piece? What about your experience and expertise will add to this conversation that this piece began? This should be related to the seed question. It also asks you to dive into your identity and experiences as well. Why are you the person to adapt this piece? What do you bring to the table? What does your version add that isn't already present in the original? What cultural cachet or baggage does the piece have that I want? Why not make a new story or a new character? What is it that I value about this piece so much or that I want to harvest from it that I feel I need to use it to tell the story I want to tell? 2. Choose your medium. What is the medium you're going to be adapting the original into? So for this question, the last part of the Merriam-Webster definition from earlier is helpful to me. A. Adjustment of a sense organ to the intensity or quality of stimulation. So adjustment of the senses to the intensity or quality of stimulation, this is a reminder to adapters to consider the emotional and sensory effects of the chosen medium that they will be working in. When considering a piece to adapt, it's important to consider the medium you're in, and then the medium that you will be shifting into, and the differences between the two of them. If you're adapting a book into a film, what are the strengths of each? What will need to be shifted in visuals, performance, or underscoring to capture the desired emotional and aesthetic effects of the original? B. Modification of an organism or its parts that makes it more fit for existence under the conditions of its environment. A heritable physical or behavioral trait that serves a specific function and improves an organism's fitness or survival. So what needs to be changed in order to survive the jump from its original medium? Like I said, consider the strengths and weaknesses of the original medium and the chosen medium. A pros and cons list might be helpful here. For example, the strengths of a book is the sheer amount of information that you can impart gracefully and explicitly. In a film, there's a lot of information to be related, but often it's much less explicit, and it relies on the audience to perceive it. You have to be choosier about what is explicitly stated or explained to the audience via dialogue or voiceover, and have to rely on design choices, costumes, set, and music a lot more. In novels, there's so much left to the imagination. Despite descriptions, the reader imagines the world as they please, or as their brain is capable. In film, you have a greater control over the visual and oral experience of the viewer. In a novel, you have the luxury of time. 400 pages is a lot more time to spend with characters and let plot occur than a 2-hour movie. 3. Build out your indispensables, so get that list from earlier. This will help to clarify how faithful your adaptation is going to be, and therefore what your process might look like. If you have a long list of indispensables, you'll likely tend towards a more faithful adaptation, and your process will probably include a lot more research and a closer relationship to the source material. If your list is short and you intend on a more provocative or subversive use of the source material, engaging with the source material less and leaning into your own creativity will likely be your process. This isn't a hard and fast rule. A loose adaptation can still be academically rigorous, and a faithful adaptation can still be full of personal creativity, but those processes will likely look and feel different. 4. Consider your audience. Who is this for? And what will it do for them? How will you convey your indispensables to them if there's a barrier? Remember the Chekhov example from earlier? Chekhov is deeply funny, but Russian humor is different from American humor. I have found myself at far too many Chekhov plays that think he wrote strictly serious dramas, but so much of his stuff feels almost farcical, absurd, tragicomic. In a Chekhov adaptation, how would you keep the humor and make it land for the audience you are picturing? If you are adapting for young people, the cultural references and images you latch onto might be different than if your audience is meant to skew academic, for example. So keep your target audience in mind. 5. Start writing and creating. This part will look different for everyone, all depending on the chosen medium and the faithfulness of the adaptation. But have fun. If you're still stuck on what exactly to adapt, think about this. Guillermo del Toro has spoken in interviews about how Frankenstein was in every other movie he has made. It took him 12 movies to make Frankenstein. And not only that, but he has been living with the story and working out what it means to him since he first read the book when he was 11 and saw the 1931 movie, which is an unfaithful adaptation, at age 7. Guillermo del Toro's adaptation is an addition to the myth of Frankenstein, one that took him many, many years to understand his role in and execute the way that he wanted. What are the pieces that you keep coming back to? And what are they helping you to understand about your life or life in general? It might not come to you for years, and that's okay. It can also be helpful to identify your favorite books and movies, classics or not. What are the tropes that are in them? The character archetypes? Are they themselves adaptations of older stories? Then go find those older stories that include those elements. Myths, poems, books, plays, images. Build a web of stories that speaks to you. Eventually, something will take form that calls to you, daring you to lend it your voice. Adaptation is perhaps the most instinctual form of storytelling. Humans have been doing it for thousands of years. Adaptation appeals to me because of its ritualistic nature. So many people before me have felt moved by the same stories that I have. So moved that they felt the need to share it in their own way, through their own medium, their own vessel, their own perspective. Art is how we have always made sense of the world, be that in ancient Greece, 1603 London, or 2026 New York City.